I stood on the platform in Maine, clutching my train ticket and a paper cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm. The trees across the tracks were a blaze of crimson and amber, just as I had pictured when I planned this trip, the 40th wedding anniversary trip for my parents, paid for, organized, and timed around their favorite season. I handed the agent my ticket. He scanned it, his brow furrowed. "This one's already been checked in," he said. I blinked. "I'm sorry." He turned the scanner toward me like it would clarify everything. "Checked in this morning. Passenger already boarded." "That's not possible," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, a knot began to form in my stomach. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my brother Ethan. "Jessica really wanted to see the fall colors. You don't even like crowds. We figured it made sense." I stared at the message, then at the train as it pulled away without me. I didn't call, didn't reply. I just stood there holding coffee I no longer wanted, surrounded by the trip I had built for people who didn't think I needed to be there. Jessica had my seat. Jessica, Ethan's girlfriend of 6 months, who once used my guest bathroom to film a TikTok with my toothbrush. And I was an afterthought. Not even that. I was a placeholder they'd quietly erased. The worst part wasn't that they left. It was that no one even thought to tell me. I used to think being dependable was something to be proud of. Growing up, I was the one who cleaned up after dinner without being asked who got straight A's while Ethan scraped by on late homework and charm. When our dad Michael lost his job the year I turned 16, I picked up shifts at the diner and handed every dollar to my mom Susan without question. She called me her little rock, and I wore the title like a badge. Ethan, on the other hand, was the baby, the one they always said just needed more time. He crashed the car twice before he turned 20 and never paid for either repair. But when he got a C in microeconomics, Mom cried tears of pride. "He's trying so hard," she said. When Ethan got into community college, I covered his books. When he dropped out, I helped him find a job. When he lost it a month later, I co-signed his lease and made the payments when he didn't. He moved in and out of my guest room more times than I can count, always with some new excuse. Jessica was just the latest version of his life on someone else's dime. I never complained out loud. I made good money as a systems analyst. I told myself I was helping. That's what good daughters do. Besides, if I didn't step up, who would Mom never asked me directly to foot the bills? She had a different way of getting there. "Your brother's doing his best, honey. It's hard out there for young people. You're lucky to have a stable career. Not everyone has your sense of responsibility." I don't think she ever thanked me. Not really, but she always made it clear she expected it. And when I gave, it was never framed as a gift. It was just what I did, who I was: reliable, strong, capable. And over the years, it became easier to be that person than to ask why no one else was. I didn't plan the anniversary trip to prove anything. I planned it because they'd once told me they'd honeymooned near the Adirondacks because Mom lit up whenever fall rolled around, because Dad still kept the old Polaroid from that trip in his dresser drawer. I thought maybe if I gave them something beautiful, they'd finally see me not just what I could offer. But looking back now, I realized they saw exactly what they always had: not a daughter, a solution. It started as an idea on a yellow sticky note: Adirondacks, October. I'd scribbled it in the margin of my work planner after Mom mentioned it over coffee, how she and Dad had honeymooned in a tiny inn near Saranac Lake with creaky floors and maple syrup on the windowsill. That afternoon, I started researching fall foliage tours. Within a week, I had everything blocked out. Scenic rail passes through New England, a 2-night stay in a historic inn with lake views, a private dinner reservation at the same restaurant they'd visited 40 years ago. I even upgraded their rooms to have a fireplace. Just like before, I wrote on the itinerary card I planned to surprise them with. I didn't need anything fancy for myself. I booked a small room at a roadside motel and took coach class on the train. The whole trip came to just under $9,000. That included everything: transportation, meals, activities, even a bouquet of fresh asters and goldenrod for their anniversary dinner. I used paid time off to make it fit between 2 major client deadlines and rearranged my calendar for the next 6 weeks so I wouldn't miss a beat at work. Ethan wasn't part of the plan. Not originally. Mom said he might be too busy with some freelance thing, which usually meant doing nothing in his apartment while Jessica practiced TikTok dances in the background. I didn't press it. Truthfully, I'd imagined this as a quiet trip, a moment for them to breathe, for me to maybe not impress them, but remind them I was here, that I still cared. It wasn't about proving my worth. I'd stopped chasing that years ago. But part of me hoped maybe this would be the thing that stuck, a memory they'd talk about at Thanksgiving, a photo they'd frame and actually send me a copy of a small crack in the wall between us. It was never about the train ride or the hotel. It was about the table. I set the effort I poured in the hope I still stupidly carried. And somehow, it still wasn't enough to get a seat. A week before the trip, I got a text from Mom. Jessica said her fall content would look amazing up there. Ethan thinks it'd be fun if we added them. Is that okay? There was no mention of where they'd stay, how they'd get there, or who would pay, just the assumption that I'd make it work. I stared at the message for a while before replying. If the rooms can still be adjusted, I'll try. That was all I said. Not because I was upset yet, but because I knew how this game worked. Every ask came draped in pleasantries framed as spontaneous, and always somehow it became my responsibility to smooth it out. I checked the reservation site that night. The inn was nearly full. I managed to get another room nearby, small and overpriced. Still, I booked it. Then I emailed the train company to confirm the seating. Our cabin could hold 4. Any more would require shifting to a different car. I asked them to hold our original reservation. I didn't hear back from Mom again. Not about logistics, not about anything. The group chat went quiet. A few days later, I saw Jessica post an Instagram story, a pair of brown leather boots and a caption, "Can't wait for fall adventures." The boots were on my living room floor. She hadn't asked before taking the picture. Something in me tightened, but I let it go because that's what I did. Even as the unease crept in, I convinced myself it would be fine, that I was being sensitive, that they wouldn't just cut me out. They wouldn't. I stayed on the platform long after the train had disappeared around the bend. The sky was soft with morning mist, and the trees swayed in slow motion like they were unaware of the hollow ache blooming inside my chest. My suitcase sat beside me untouched, pointless. No one called. No one texted again. Not Ethan, not Mom, not even a generic sorry for the mix-up. I wasn't part of the mistake. I was the mistake. And Jessica, she got the scenic view, the curated experience, the seat I held for months while building an itinerary. They never asked for, but happily accepted. I didn't cry. Not then. I walked to the cafe across from the station, ordered another coffee I didn't want, and sat by the window watching strangers board buses to places I hadn't planned for. I scrolled through social media. Ethan had posted a photo, Mom and Dad smiling on the train platform, arms looped with Jessica's. The caption read, "Family Fall Getaway. Finally making memories together." The word "together" struck harder than I expected, like it excluded me on purpose, like they'd finally achieved a picture-perfect version of themselves now that I was gone. I didn't comment. I didn't like the photo. I just locked my phone and stared at the tabletop, tracing the scratches in the wood like they could offer answers. They didn't forget me. They made a choice, and I needed to make one too. I didn't go home. Instead, I rented a car and drove north. No plan, no GPS, just a vague memory of a quiet town I'd once passed through on a solo work trip. It was called Stowe. Small, tucked into the folds of Vermont, the kind of place where no one asked questions and the air smelled like pine. I found a roadside inn with vacancy and a fireplace, then checked in without unpacking. The room had a window that looked out onto a gravel path lined with sugar maples. I sat by it that evening with a blanket over my lap and a cup of chamomile I didn't finish. For 2 days, I didn't check my phone. I didn't reply to the few texts that trickled in. Nothing from Mom, just a group message from Ethan asking if I'd gotten mixed up on the train schedule. No apology, just a soft punchline with a shrug underneath. I left it on red. Instead, I walked through orchards shedding their last red leaves, through antique shops selling things no one really needed. I bought a postcard, but didn't write anything on it. I thought about sending it to myself, then folded it into a book and forgot it was there. I let the quiet settle inside me like something earned. For the first time in years, I didn't have to explain my silence or hold space for someone else's mess. I didn't have to adjust my tone, downplay my hurt, or tell myself I was being dramatic. I was alone, and it didn't feel empty. It felt honest. The trip I'd planned was gone. The people I'd planned it for had made their choice, and now I was making mine. I got back to my apartment late Tuesday afternoon. The sky was low and gray, the kind of quiet overcast that made the whole street feel like it was holding its breath. I dropped my bag by the door and didn't bother unpacking. Out of habit, I opened Facebook. Mom had posted again 24 photos from the trip. She'd tagged Ethan, Jessica, and even the bed and breakfast. Not me. There was one image that stopped me, the dinner table I had reserved months ago, candles flickering, a bouquet of goldenrod and asters in the center. My centerpiece, my reservation, my handwriting still faintly visible on the place cards. Jessica sat where I was supposed to be. The caption read, "Grateful for our children who made this anniversary so special. Couldn't have asked for a more loving weekend." I closed the app. The next morning, I got an email from Mom's shared account with Dad's subject line photos from the trip. No message, just the images attached in bulk as if I were a distant cousin who'd missed a reunion. "No, we missed you. No, where were you?" Just evidence. Proof that the weekend happened without me. That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. It was the family they'd chosen to show up for. The next day, I drove to the house, my house. The one I bought 6 years ago with my name on every document and every bill. The one I'd let them live in rent-free. They weren't home. I walked through each room slowly. The guest towels I bought were faded. The kitchen smelled like someone else's cooking. Jessica's raincoat hung on the banister. I stood in the dining room, the same room Mom had once called hers during a birthday toast. And I realized something so simple it felt like a revelation. They weren't renters, they were takers, and I was done offering. The lease adjustment notice went out the next morning. I printed 2 copies, one for the kitchen counter, the other mailed certified. It was clean professional, no sharp language, just numbers and dates. The rent now at market rate. Utilities no longer bundled. Guest privileges revoked unless approved in writing. There was a deadline the 1st of the month. I didn't include a note. I didn't owe them one. That afternoon, I got a call from Mom. She didn't start with "Hello, Olivia." "What is this? Are you seriously charging us rent?" There was no trace of confusion in her voice, only offense. "This is cruel," she continued. "We're your parents." I waited a beat before answering. "Then maybe you should have treated me like your daughter." She scoffed. "So, this is about that trip I said. Nothing." "We didn't mean to hurt you," she added, softening. "It just happened." I could hear her walking through the living room, the creak of the old floorboard near the front window. "Your father's upset," she said, but Michael hadn't called, hadn't texted. I wasn't sure if he even knew or cared. "You could have just talked to us," she said. "I could have. I chose this instead." "You've got until the 1st," I said gently. "After that, it becomes legal. You're not serious." "I am." She hung up. For a long time, I stood at the kitchen sink and stared at the faucet. Not angry, not proud, just steady. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. But it wasn't theirs either. It had been a gift. Now it was a boundary. The email came 3 days later from a local law office I didn't recognize, subject intent to dispute ownership. Inside was a scanned letter. My parents, through counsel, were asserting long-term financial contributions and shared occupancy, claiming partial rights to the house. No dollar amounts, no documents, just vague language meant to sound formal and intimidating. I forwarded it to my attorney. He called within the hour. "There's nothing here," he said. "They've got no legal standing." This is noise. But it wasn't just noise. It was confirmation. They weren't sorry. They were retaliating. Ethan showed up the next evening. He looked like he hadn't slept. His usual careless swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, unfocused guilt. "Jessica left," he said, standing awkwardly on the front step. "Said she didn't sign up for all this family crap." He didn't ask to come in, just stood there like maybe the door would open out of habit. "I don't have anywhere to go," he added. "You know that, right? I did. But I also knew what came next if I let him in." "I'm not your safety net," I said. He looked down at his shoes, then back up, eyes glassy but dry. "I didn't mean to hurt you." he said, but he didn't say sorry. Not really, and I didn't say anything at all. Dad never called. Not after the rent notice, not after the legal letter, not even when Ethan showed up with nowhere to go. He didn't yell, didn't text, didn't ask me why. But that wasn't new. Growing up, his silence had always been the backdrop. When Mom pushed too hard, when Ethan acted out when I broke down under the weight of being the steady one, he'd just sip his coffee and disappear into the next room. His neutrality had a softness to it that made it feel harmless, almost gentle. But now I saw it clearly. It wasn't gentleness. It was consent in silence. He had let it all happen, every ask, every assumption, every time they took from me without thanks or pause. And now he was letting this happen too. The day I dropped off their certified notice, he was out front watering the bushes. He looked up as I walked past. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. It was the only thing he'd said to me in weeks. I looked him in the eye and answered just as quietly. "I do." He didn't respond, just turned the hose back to the rosebush as if he hadn't heard anything at all. 3 weeks later, I moved into a small loft across the river. Exposed brick-high windows, just enough space for me and my quiet. No footsteps overhead, no doors slamming, no voices asking for something. I bought a second-hand couch, a real tea kettle, and a lamp I actually liked. The air smelled like dust and new paint. I opened the windows anyway. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for my phone to buzz. No group chats asking for grocery money. No guilt-soaked check-ins disguised as concern. Just mornings with my own schedule and evenings that belonged only to me. Ethan hasn't texted since that last night on the porch. Jessica deleted our photos, unfollowed the whole family. And my parents, well, they've gone quiet too. Mom tried one last time, a message with no greeting. "We miss who you used to be," I replied. "You miss the version of me who never said no. She's gone." There was no answer after that. Sometimes I walk past the park near the train station and sit on the same bench where I read Ethan's message the day they left me behind. I don't replay it anymore. I just sit because that's what peace feels like. Not a celebration, not revenge, just the absence of noise. I used to think saying no would make me heartless. Now I know it made me whole. Last week I booked a train to New Hampshire. No itinerary, no group chat, no anniversary dinner to coordinate. Just me, a window seat, and a quiet town with a bookstore I've always wanted to visit. I didn't ask anyone's permission, didn't check anyone's calendar, didn't offer to bring souvenirs. I packed light one-bag a notebook and a sweater that still smells faintly of cedar. At the station, I paused before boarding just for a second and let myself remember that morning in Maine. The sting was gone. All that remained was clarity. I am not their fixer, not their fallback, not their foundation. I am not their plan B. I am my own beginning. There's a sticky note on my new bathroom mirror. Just 5 words I wrote after the move, when the silence was still raw. I owe myself the most. And every morning I read it like a promise. Some stories aren't told for sympathy. They're told for recognition. If this one made something inside you stir, then maybe it wasn't just a story. Was there a moment you finally said enough? Tell us your words might be the light someone else needs. Like if you've ever felt invisible in the family you built. Subscribe to hear stories that don't just end, they free. Looking back, I see the weight I carried wasn't just responsibility. It was a role I let define me. I thought being dependable meant saying yes to every ask, absorbing every slight and fixing every mess. But that morning in Maine, when the train left without me, I learned silence can be louder than words. My family's choice to erase me wasn't a mistake. It was a mirror showing me how I'd let myself become invisible. I'd built their world while neglecting my own. Saying no wasn't heartless, it was survival. It taught me that love doesn't mean sacrifice without reciprocity. I owe myself boundaries, not just effort. That sticky note on my mirror, "I owe myself the most," isn't just a reminder. It's a vow. I learned to value my own space, to choose myself without guilt. Peace isn't loud or vengeful. It's the quiet of a life reclaimed. I'm not here to fix anyone else's story anymore. I'm writing my own, one deliberate step at a time, starting with me.
The silence that followed the Nobel Committee's call stretched through my parents' dining room like a physical presence. 23 family members, gathered for what was supposed to be my cousin Elena's engagement celebration, stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to something approaching terror. My father's fork hung suspended halfway to his mouth. A piece of my mother's famous tres leches cake balanced precariously on the tines. His declaration about my worthless research still echoed in the air, competing with the voice on my phone that had just congratulated me on winning the Nobel Prize in Physics. "I'm sorry," I said into the phone, stepping away from the table slightly. "Could you repeat that?" The connection seemed unclear. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and unmistakably Swedish. "Dr. Martinez, this is Secretary General Anderson from the Nobel Committee. I'm calling to formally inform you that you have been awarded this year's Nobel Prize in Physics for your groundbreaking work on quantum gravity theory and its applications to understanding dark matter." My mother's wine glass slipped from her fingers, the crystal shattering against her good china plate. The red wine spread across the white tablecloth like blood, but nobody moved to clean it up. Everyone was too busy staring at me with the expression of people watching their understanding of reality undergo fundamental reconstruction. "I see," I said calmly into the phone. "I'm honored by the committee's decision." Secretary General Anderson continued with the formal details: the ceremony in Stockholm, the media requirements, the $1 million prize, while my family sat frozen around the dining room table like figures in a very expensive tableau. When I ended the call, the silence was absolute. My father was the first to break. But you're unemployed," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been living in our basement for 2 years working on whatever it is you do on that computer." It was true that I'd been living in my childhood bedroom since completing my postdoctoral fellowship at CERN. What my family didn't understand was that theoretical physics research doesn't require a traditional office. It requires time, computational resources, and the freedom to think about problems that might not have solutions. Living rent-free in my parents' basement had provided exactly the stability I needed to focus on the mathematics that govern the universe's most fundamental mysteries. My sister Carmen, who'd been notably quiet during the evening's earlier discussion of my career failures, was staring at her phone screen with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "Miguel," she said slowly, "it says here that Dr. Miguel Martinez is a theoretical physicist who solved the unified field theory problem." She looked up at me. That's you." I nodded. The dark matter calculations took longer than expected, but the mathematics finally worked out last spring. My uncle Roberto, who owned a successful construction company and had spent most of dinner explaining why practical work was more valuable than playing with equations, was reading what appeared to be a news article on his phone. "It says here that your research explains how 95% of the universe works." His voice carried the tone of someone discovering that gravity might actually flow upward. "How is that possible?" The research had indeed focused on the universe's missing mass, the dark matter and dark energy that comprised most of reality but remained invisible to conventional observation. The mathematical framework I'd developed provided a unified explanation for how these mysterious components interacted with ordinary matter, effectively bridging the gap between quantum mechanics and general relativity that had puzzled physicists for nearly a century. But explaining all of that to people who'd just spent 2 hours discussing my lack of employment seemed somewhat challenging. My cousin Elena, whose engagement we were supposedly celebrating, had apparently forgotten about her own party. "Miguel, I'm looking at your Wikipedia page," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It says you published papers in Physical Review Letters, Nature and Science, and that you've been working on this research since you were a graduate student at MIT. My mother, who'd been advocating for practical employment just minutes earlier, was staring at her phone with the expression of someone watching their fundamental assumptions about reality undergo systematic demolition. "It says here that you have a PhD from MIT and that you did postdoctoral work at CERN." She looked at me with something approaching awe. "When did you go to Switzerland?" "I spent 3 years there," I said simply, working with the Large Hadron Collider team to test some of the theoretical predictions. The revelation seemed to multiply rather than resolve the family's confusion. My father, who'd been so certain about my research being worthless, was conducting what appeared to be a frantic Google search. Miguel, he said slowly, it says here that CERN is where they discovered the Higgs boson. And that you were part of the theoretical team that predicted its properties. I'd actually contributed to the mathematical framework that helped identify the Higgs field's characteristics, but that work had been part of a much larger collaborative effort involving thousands of scientists. The Nobel Prize was being awarded specifically for my subsequent research into dark matter interactions, which had been a more solitary endeavor. Elena was reading what appeared to be a university press release. It says MIT considers you one of their most distinguished alumni, and that your research has been cited over 15,000 times by other scientists. She looked around the table. 15,000 citations means that other researchers are building on your work to advance human knowledge. My cousin David, who'd been explaining earlier why I needed to get serious about life, was scrolling through what appeared to be academic articles. I can't understand any of this, he admitted, but it looks like you've basically rewritten how we understand the universe. The unified field theory had indeed required rethinking some fundamental assumptions about how matter and energy interacted at cosmic scales. The mathematics was elegant in its simplicity, but it had taken 15 years of work to arrive at equations that could explain everything from quantum particle behavior to galactic rotation curves. Roberta was reading what appeared to be a news analysis piece. It says here that your research could lead to revolutionary advances in energy production and space travel. He looked at me with something approaching reverence. Are you going to change how humans live? The practical applications were still theoretical, but the mathematical framework suggested possibilities that had seemed like science fiction just decades earlier. Understanding how dark matter influenced space-time geometry could potentially lead to new forms of propulsion and energy generation, though those engineering challenges would require decades of additional work. My Aunt Sophia, who'd been notably vocal about my need to find steady employment, was reading what appeared to be a financial analysis of Nobel Prize winners. Miguel, she said quietly, it says here that Nobel laureates often become very wealthy through speaking engagements, consulting work, and book deals. She paused. And that the prize comes with $1 million. The money was significant, but it was also secondary to the scientific recognition. The Nobel Prize represented validation from the international physics community that the work had fundamental importance for human understanding of reality. Carmen was reading what appeared to be a biography. It says you started working on unified field theory as a 25-year-old graduate student, and that other physicists thought the problem was unsolvable. She looked at me with something approaching disbelief. You spent 15 years working on something that everyone said was impossible? The impossibility had been part of the appeal. Physics was full of problems that seemed intractable until someone developed the right mathematical tools to address them. Einstein's relativity, quantum mechanics, the Standard Model, all of these breakthrough theories had initially seemed too radical to be correct. My father was reading what appeared to be a timeline of my academic career. Son, he said slowly, it says here that you graduated summa cum laude from Harvard, completed your PhD at MIT in record time, and were recruited by CERN before you turned 30. He looked at me with the expression of someone discovering that their child had been leading a double life. Why didn't you ever tell us any of this? The question was fair. I'd been living in their basement for 2 years, contributing occasionally to household expenses with consulting work, while keeping my research activities largely private. The family had interpreted my quiet lifestyle as evidence of career failure, when in reality I'd been focusing intensively on mathematical problems that required extended periods of uninterrupted thought. Elena found a video interview I'd given to Scientific American the previous year. Miguel, you're explaining quantum gravity like it's basic arithmetic. She looked around the table. I took 2 years of college physics and I can't understand anything you're saying. David was reading what appeared to be a university press release about my research funding. It says here that you've received grants totaling over $8 million from the National Science Foundation, NASA, and the Department of Energy. He looked at me with something approaching awe. That's more money than most people see in their entire lives. The federal funding had been essential for the computational resources needed to test the theoretical predictions. Dark matter research required sophisticated mathematical modeling that pushed the limits of available supercomputing capacity. Sophia was reading what appeared to be a news article about potential Nobel Prize winners. Miguel, it says here that you've been considered a leading candidate for the physics prize for the past 3 years. She looked at me with something between amazement and accusation. Did you know this was coming? The speculation had been flattering but also somewhat distracting. Nobel Prize predictions were notoriously unreliable, and I tried not to pay attention to the annual media coverage of potential winners. The scientific work itself was the reward. The recognition, while meaningful, was secondary to the satisfaction of solving problems that had puzzled humanity for generations. Roberto found a documentary that featured my research. There's a whole section about how unified field theory could revolutionize space exploration and energy production. He looked at me with something approaching reverence. Are you basically helping to build the future? My mother, who'd been advocating for practical employment, was reading what appeared to be an analysis of the physics job market. It says here that theoretical physicists with your credentials typically earn salaries in the high six figures, and that major universities compete aggressively to recruit Nobel laureates. She looked at me with something approaching disbelief. You could probably work anywhere you want. The employment opportunities were indeed extensive, but they were also somewhat irrelevant to the research itself. The mathematics of unified field theory didn't depend on institutional affiliation or salary negotiations. It depended on asking the right questions about how reality was constructed at its most fundamental level. Elena was reading what appeared to be a comparison of Nobel Prize winners by age. Miguel, it says here that you're the youngest physicist to win the prize in over 40 years. She looked around the table. And that your research is considered one of the most important theoretical advances since Einstein's relativity. The comparison to Einstein was generous but not entirely inaccurate. Unified field theory did represent a similar leap in understanding to what relativity had provided in the early 20th century. Both theories required abandoning intuitive assumptions about how reality worked in favor of mathematical descriptions that initially seemed too strange to be true. Carmen found a video of my Nobel Prize announcement. They're calling your work a revolutionary contribution to human understanding of the cosmos, she read aloud, and saying that it fundamentally changes how physicists think about the universe. My father, who'd declared my research worthless less than 30 minutes earlier, was staring at his phone with the expression of someone whose understanding of the world had undergone complete reconstruction. Miguel, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. We all do. The way we talked about your work, your career, we were completely wrong. I considered his words carefully. The family's concern about my employment status hadn't been entirely unreasonable. Theoretical physics was indeed an uncertain career path, and many brilliant researchers struggled to find stable positions. Their criticism had come from a place of caring, even if their understanding of academic research had been somewhat limited. You weren't wrong to be concerned, I said gently. Theoretical physics is a difficult field, and most research doesn't lead to breakthrough discoveries. I was fortunate that the mathematics worked out. Roberto was reading what appeared to be an analysis of the practical implications of my research. It says here that your unified field theory could lead to new forms of energy that make fossil fuels obsolete. He looked at me with something approaching disbelief. Are you going to save the planet? The environmental applications were promising but still decades away from practical implementation. Understanding how dark energy influenced cosmic expansion could potentially lead to new approaches to energy generation, but the engineering challenges remained formidable. David found a news article about the Nobel Prize ceremony. Miguel, it says here that you'll be meeting with the King of Sweden and giving a lecture to the international physics community. He looked at me with something approaching awe. You're going to be famous. The ceremony would indeed involve significant public attention, but that wasn't really the purpose of the research. Physics was about understanding how reality worked, not about achieving celebrity status. The Nobel Prize was meaningful because it represented recognition from the scientific community that the work had contributed something valuable to human knowledge. Sophia was reading what appeared to be a financial analysis of Nobel Prize winners. It says here that Nobel laureates often become very wealthy through consulting work, speaking engagements, and commercial applications of their research. She paused. Miguel, are you going to be rich? The commercial potential was substantial but uncertain. Unified field theory could indeed lead to revolutionary technologies, but the timeline for practical applications was measured in decades rather than years. The immediate value was intellectual rather than financial. We now understood something about the universe that had been mysterious since the beginning of human civilization. My mother approached with the careful expression of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. Miguel, she said quietly, I have to ask, when we would suggest that you needed to find practical work, when we would worry about your future, what were you thinking? The question struck at the heart of the disconnect that had characterized family gatherings for the past several years. While my parents had been concerned about my employment prospects, I'd been focused on mathematical problems that might not have solutions. The research had been all-consuming in the best possible way. Every day brought new insights into how the universe functioned at its most fundamental level. I was usually thinking about dark matter equations, I said honestly. The mathematics required complete focus, and I was fortunate to have the time and space to work without distraction. Elena was reading what appeared to be a timeline of major physics breakthroughs. Miguel, it says here that unified field theory is being compared to Newton's laws of motion and Einstein's relativity. She looked around the table. You've basically made a discovery that will be remembered for centuries. The historical significance was humbling rather than gratifying. Physics advanced through the accumulated work of thousands of researchers building on each other's insights across generations. My contribution had been to develop mathematical tools that could bridge the gap between quantum mechanics and relativity, but that work had only been possible because of the foundation laid by countless previous scientists. Carmen found a video of physicists discussing the implications of my research. They're saying that your work opens up entirely new fields of study and that it will take decades for the physics community to fully explore the implications. She looked at me with something approaching disbelief. You've basically given humanity a new way to understand reality. My father, who'd been so certain about the worthlessness of theoretical research, was reading what appeared to be an explanation of unified field theory written for general audiences. Son, he said slowly, I'm trying to understand what you actually discovered, but the concepts are... He paused, apparently searching for words. Beyond what most people need to think about, I finished. The mathematics describes how matter and energy interact at cosmic scales, but it doesn't have much relevance to daily life. Roberto was reading what appeared to be a news analysis of the Nobel Prize announcement. It says here that your research represents the most significant theoretical advance in physics since the discovery of quantum mechanics. He looked at me with something approaching reverence. How does someone even begin to think about problems like that? The process had been less dramatic than it might sound. Unified field theory had emerged from asking simple questions about why the universe behaved differently at different scales. Why did quantum mechanics work for small particles while relativity described large objects? The mathematics that answered those questions had required years of work, but the underlying curiosity was straightforward. David found an article about the commercial potential of my research. Miguel, it says here that major tech companies and government agencies are already trying to recruit you for consulting work. He paused. And that the patent applications related to your research could be worth billions of dollars. The intellectual property questions were complex but largely irrelevant to the scientific work itself. Unified field theory was a mathematical description of how reality functioned. It belonged to humanity rather than to any individual or organization. Sophia was reading what appeared to be a comparison of Nobel Prize winners' subsequent careers. It says here that Nobel laureates typically become extremely influential in their fields and often advise governments on scientific policy. She looked at me with something approaching awe. You're going to help shape how humanity develops technologically. The policy implications were indeed significant. Understanding how dark matter and dark energy influenced cosmic evolution could inform everything from space exploration strategies to energy research priorities. But those conversations would involve the broader scientific community rather than individual decision-making. My mother, who'd been advocating for practical employment throughout dinner, was staring at a photo of the Nobel Prize medal. Miguel, she said quietly, I have to admit, this is completely beyond anything I imagined was possible. She paused. When you were a child, you were always asking questions about how things worked, but I never thought that it would lead to understanding how the universe works. Elena suggested. She'd apparently become the family's designated interpreter of scientific achievement. The childhood curiosity had indeed been the foundation for everything that followed. Physics was essentially about asking increasingly sophisticated versions of the same questions that children ask naturally. Why do things fall down? Why is the sky blue? Why do stars shine? The mathematics required to answer those questions at a professional level was complex, but the underlying motivation was universal human curiosity. Carmen found a documentary about dark matter research that featured my work. Miguel, they're explaining how your research solves mysteries that have puzzled scientists for decades. She looked around the table. You've basically answered questions about 95% of the universe that no one understood before. The percentage was accurate. Dark matter and dark energy comprised the vast majority of reality, but they'd remained invisible and mysterious until the mathematical framework I'd developed provided a way to understand their behavior. It was satisfying to contribute something meaningful to humanity's understanding of its cosmic context. My father approached with the expression of someone who'd realized that his fundamental assumptions about reality might need revision. Son, he said quietly, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an acknowledgement that I completely misunderstood what you were working on and why it mattered. The misunderstanding had been natural and even reasonable. Theoretical physics research looked like unemployment to people unfamiliar with how scientific breakthroughs actually happened. The work required long periods of apparent inactivity while mathematical concepts developed slowly in the background of consciousness. Roberto was reading what appeared to be an analysis of the economic implications of unified field theory. Miguel, it says here that your research could lead to technological advances that revolutionize transportation, energy production, and space exploration. He looked at me with something approaching disbelief. Are you going to change how humans live in the universe? The technological possibilities were intriguing but remained speculative. Understanding how dark matter influenced space-time geometry could potentially lead to new approaches to propulsion and energy generation, but the engineering challenges would require decades of additional research by teams of scientists and engineers. Elena was reading what appeared to be international reaction to the Nobel Prize announcement. Miguel, it says here that physicists around the world are calling your work a watershed moment for human understanding of reality. She looked at me with something approaching awe. You've basically advanced human civilization. The advancement was collective rather than individual. Unified field theory built on centuries of previous discoveries by thousands of researchers. My contribution had been to develop mathematical tools that could synthesize existing knowledge into a more complete picture. But that work had only been possible because of the foundation laid by the entire scientific community. David found a video of my Nobel Prize acceptance speech rehearsal. Miguel, you're explaining how your research connects to the biggest questions about existence and humanity's place in the cosmos. He looked around the table. You're basically a philosopher of the universe. The philosophical implications were indeed profound. Understanding how matter and energy interacted at cosmic scales inevitably led to questions about consciousness, free will, and the nature of reality itself. Physics had always existed at the intersection of mathematics and metaphysics. My mother, who'd spent dinner advocating for practical employment, was reading what appeared to be predictions about my future career. Miguel, she said slowly, it says here that Nobel Prize winners typically become some of the most influential people in their fields and often serve as advisors to governments and international organizations. The influence was a responsibility rather than a privilege. Scientific understanding carried obligations to help humanity make informed decisions about its future development. The research would be meaningful only if it contributed to human flourishing rather than merely satisfying intellectual curiosity. As the family continued processing this unexpected revelation, I reflected on the strange trajectory that had led from childhood questions about stars to mathematical descriptions of cosmic evolution. The Nobel Prize represented validation from the international physics community, but it also marked the beginning of new responsibilities and challenges. My phone buzzed with another call, this time from the President's science advisor, requesting a briefing on the national security implications of unified field theory. I answered on the second ring. This is Dr. Martinez. The conversation that followed involved classified applications of dark matter research and requests for immediate consultation on federal science policy. As I discussed technical details with government officials, I could see my family listening with the expression of people discovering that their understanding of the world had been fundamentally incomplete. When I ended the call, the dining room was completely silent again. That was the White House, I said simply. My father stared at me for a long moment, then began to laugh. It wasn't bitter laughter or embarrassed laughter. It was the laughter of someone who'd just realized that reality was far more interesting than they'd imagined. "Miguel," he said finally, "I think we need to have a very different conversation about your career." The irony wasn't lost on me that Mike had chosen Bella Vista for our parents' 35th wedding anniversary celebration. Of all the upscale restaurants in the city, he'd picked the flagship location of my restaurant chain. Not that he knew that, of course. To Mike, I was still his little sister Lisa who worked in food service. His dismissive way of describing what he assumed was a waitressing job or maybe something in catering. "I wanted somewhere really special for Mom and Dad," he'd announced when making the reservation 2 weeks ago. "Somewhere that shows how much we appreciate them. I know it's expensive, Lisa, but don't worry about your portion. I've got this covered. Don't worry about my portion." As if I couldn't afford to split a dinner bill at my own restaurant. Mike had always been like this, ever since we were kids. 5 years older, perpetually convinced that his success as a regional sales manager for a medical device company made him the family's financial authority. He'd graduated college, gotten married, bought a house in the suburbs, and somehow decided this meant he was responsible for managing everyone else's life choices. "Lisa's still figuring things out," he'd tell people as if I were 22 instead of 31. "She's got time to find her path." My path, apparently, was a mystery to him despite being perfectly clear to anyone who bothered to look. But Mike had never bothered to look. He'd seen me working in restaurants during college and somehow frozen that image in his mind, unable to update it even as years passed and circumstances changed dramatically. The reservation was for 6:30 on a Saturday night, prime time at Bella Vista. I'd arrived early and was already seated when the family started filtering in. Mom and Dad looked elegant in their anniversary best. Dad in the navy suit he saved for special occasions, Mom in a dress she'd probably bought specifically for tonight. Mike's wife Jennifer had on something expensive-looking with designer accessories that she kept adjusting self-consciously. And Mike himself wore his success like a cologne, strong and impossible to ignore. "Lisa," Mom had exclaimed, giving me a tight hug. "You look lovely, sweetheart." I'd chosen a simple black dress and understated jewelry, nothing flashy. I'd learned years ago that dressing too expensively around my family led to uncomfortable questions about where I got the money. It was easier to blend in and let them maintain their assumptions. "This place is incredible," Jennifer whispered to me as we sat down, her eyes wide as she took in the restaurant's elegant interior. "Mike said it's one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city." She wasn't wrong. Bella Vista had taken 3 years to develop, from finding the perfect location to hiring the head chef to designing every detail of the interior. The result was exactly what I'd envisioned, sophisticated without being pretentious, elegant without being stuffy. The kind of place that felt special for anniversaries and celebrations, but still warm and welcoming. "It's very nice," I agreed, scanning the familiar dining room. I could see Marcus, the general manager, moving between tables with his usual quiet efficiency. He'd spotted me when I arrived and given me the subtle nod we'd agreed on years ago, acknowledgement without drawing attention. Mike was studying the menu with the intensity of someone trying to calculate exactly how much this dinner was going to cost him. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath. $48 for salmon? "It's their anniversary, honey," Jennifer reminded him quietly. "And you said we wanted somewhere special." I know," Mike replied, still frowning at the prices. "It's just, this is more than some people make in a day." He glanced at me when he said it and I knew exactly what he was thinking. This is more than Lisa probably makes in a day. Maybe more than she makes in 2 days. Dad was looking around the restaurant with genuine appreciation. "This is beautiful, Mike. Really beautiful. Your mother and I haven't been somewhere this fancy in years." "Well, you deserve it," Mike replied, puffing up slightly at the praise. 35 years of marriage is a big deal. Only the best for you too." The server arrived to take our drink orders and I recognized him immediately. David had been working at Bella Vista for 2 years now, ever since graduating from hospitality school. He was professional, knowledgeable, and completely dedicated to providing excellent service. "Good evening," he said with a warm smile. "Welcome to Bella Vista. Can I start you off with something to drink?" Mike ordered wine for the table, not the most expensive option but not the cheapest either. A middle ground choice that would seem generous without breaking his budget. David nodded approvingly at the selection, which seemed to please Mike. "Excellent choice, sir," David said. "I'll be right back with that." As he walked away, Mike leaned back in his chair with satisfaction. "This is how you celebrate an anniversary," he announced. "None of that chain restaurant nonsense. Real food, real atmosphere, real service. Real service." If only he knew how much thought had gone into training the staff to provide exactly that level of excellence. The conversation over appetizers followed predictable patterns. Mike talked about his recent promotion, his new company car, and the vacation he and Jennifer were planning to Hawaii. Jennifer shared updates about their house renovation and her part-time job at a boutique. Mom and Dad beamed at their successful son and daughter-in-law, asking all the right questions and making all the appropriate impressed noises. When they turned to me, the energy shifted noticeably. "So Lisa," Dad said, "how's work going?" "Still in the restaurant business." "The restaurant business?" As if it were some kind of temporary phase I was going through. "Yes," I replied simply. "Still in restaurants." Mike nodded approvingly. "There's nothing wrong with food service," he said in the tone of someone being deliberately charitable. "It's honest work. And Lisa's always been good with people." Good with people. The kind of thing you say about someone whose career you don't quite understand but want to be supportive of anyway. "Are you still at that place downtown?" Mom asked. "The one you mentioned last Christmas?" "I work at several places," I said, which was true in a way they wouldn't understand. Mike's eyebrows went up. "Several places? Lisa, are you working multiple jobs? Because if money's tight, you know Jennifer and I could help you out. Maybe help you find something more stable." Something more stable. Like his sales job, presumably. Something with regular hours, benefits, and a clear hierarchy that would make sense to him. "I'm doing fine," I assured him. "But thank you. It's just," Mike continued, warming to his theme, "you're 31 now. At some point you need to think about your future. Career advancement, retirement savings, health insurance. All that adult stuff. The stuff. Because apparently working in restaurants wasn't adult enough for his standards." Jennifer was looking around the dining room again, her expression slightly anxious. "This really is an expensive place," she whispered to Mike. "Are you sure about this?" Mike waved her concern away, but I could see the tension in his jaw. "It's fine. It's their anniversary." But I could tell it wasn't fine. I could see him doing mental calculations, probably figuring out exactly how much this dinner was going to set him back and how long it would take to recover financially. The irony was painful. My brother was stressed about paying for dinner at a restaurant that generated enough profit to cover his entire annual salary in less than 2 weeks. The entrees arrived, and David performed his usual impeccable service, checking that everything met our expectations and ensuring our water glasses never went empty. Mike seemed impressed despite himself. "This is really good service," he admitted to Jennifer. "You can tell this is a high-class establishment." High-class establishment. The phrase pleased me more than it probably should have. It was during the main course that things took a sharper turn. Mike had been drinking steadily throughout the dinner, not enough to be drunk, but enough to lower his usual filters. And Mike with lowered filters was Mike at his most patronizing. "You know, Lisa," he said, cutting into his steak with deliberate precision, "I've been thinking about your situation." "My situation? Here we go. I think I might be able to help you out," he continued. "There's a girl in my office, Amanda, who used to manage restaurants before she got into medical device sales. She says there are lots of opportunities for restaurant people to transition into other industries." Other industries. Because restaurant work was apparently something you needed to transition out of, like a disease you recovered from. "The key," Mike went on, "is to position your experience the right way. Customer service, crisis management, working under pressure. Those are all transferable skills." Transferable skills. He was talking about my career like I was unemployed and needed help finding work. "Mike," Mom said gently, "maybe Lisa's happy doing what she's doing." "Sure, she might be happy," Mike agreed, "but happiness doesn't pay the bills. And it doesn't set you up for a secure future." He turned to me, his expression earnest in the way that meant he was about to deliver what he considered crucial life advice. "Lisa, I love you and I want what's best for you. But look around." He gestured at the elegant restaurants surrounding us. "This is what success looks like. This is what you get when you make smart career choices. The irony was so thick I could practically taste it. Find somewhere you can actually afford, he continued, his voice getting louder as the wine kicked in. I mean, I know I said I'd cover tonight, but honestly, Lisa, places like this aren't really for people in your situation. The words hung in the air like expensive perfume. Other diners were starting to glance over, probably wondering what was happening at our table. Mom looked mortified. Mike, that's not necessary. I'm not being mean, Mike protested. I'm being realistic. Lisa needs to understand that there are different levels in life. Some people can afford places like this regularly and some people can't. That's just how it is. Dad was looking uncomfortable now. Son, maybe we should. No, Dad, this is important, Mike interrupted. Someone needs to tell Lisa these things. She's living in some kind of fantasy where she thinks working in restaurants is going to lead to, what? Owning them someday. He laughed at his own joke, apparently finding the idea of me owning restaurants genuinely amusing. This is more than you make in a year, Mom added, though her voice was quieter, as if she was trying to soften the blow while still supporting her successful son's assessment of the situation. The entire dining room seemed to quiet around our table. I could feel other diners' eyes on us, probably wondering why this well-dressed family was having what appeared to be a financial intervention in the middle of an upscale restaurant. I looked at my family's faces. Mike's expression was earnest, convinced he was delivering necessary tough love. Jennifer looked embarrassed but was clearly not going to contradict her husband. Mom and Dad seemed caught between wanting to support their successful son and feeling uncomfortable with his approach. They were all waiting for my response, probably expecting tears or anger or grateful acknowledgement that they were right to be concerned about my situation. Instead, I nodded calmly and said, "Understood." The simple agreement seemed to deflate some of the tension Mike had been building. He'd clearly been prepared for pushback, maybe even hoping for some drama that would prove his point about my emotional immaturity or inability to face reality. "Good," he said, though he looked slightly confused by my calm response. "That's good, Lisa. That's mature." Because agreeing with his assessment of my failures was apparently evidence of personal growth. Jennifer was adjusting her napkin nervously. "Maybe we should talk about something else," she suggested. "It's Mom and Dad's anniversary after all." "You're right," Mike agreed. "I just want Lisa to understand that family looks out for each other. That's what tonight is about, celebrating success and supporting each other through challenges." Supporting each other through challenges. He saw himself as the successful family member helping his struggling sister understand reality. The protector, the provider, the one with enough perspective to see things clearly. I was about to respond when I noticed movement at the edge of my vision. Marcus, the general manager, was approaching our table with purposeful steps. I'd worked with Marcus for 5 years now, ever since opening the second Bella Vista location. He was absolutely professional, completely devoted to the restaurant's success, and had an uncanny ability to handle any situation with grace. He was also walking directly toward our table with an expression that suggested he needed to speak with me about something important. My family noticed him coming. Mike straightened up, probably assuming the manager was approaching to compliment him on his choice of restaurant or to ensure everything was satisfactory with our anniversary celebration. Jennifer smoothed her hair, preparing to receive what she no doubt expected would be recognition of their table's obvious importance. Marcus reached our table and smiled politely at everyone before turning his attention directly to me. "Chef's compliments to the owner, Ms. Chin," he began, his voice carrying clearly across our section of the dining room. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Mike's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Jennifer's wine glass tilted dangerously in her suddenly slack grip. Mom's eyes went wide and Dad's mouth opened slightly in shock. Marcus continued, apparently oblivious to the family drama he'd just detonated. "I apologize for interrupting your family dinner, but Chef Rodriguez wanted me to ask about tomorrow's menu tasting for the new location. Also, the food critic from Metropolitan Magazine is here for the review. She's at table 12 if you'd like to greet her personally." He paused, glancing around the table with professional courtesy. "And the quarterly profit reports are ready for your review whenever convenient. We're up 18% from last quarter across all locations." All locations. The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "I hope everyone is enjoying their anniversary celebration," Marcus added with a warm smile. "Please let me know if there's anything else you need." After he walked away, the silence at our table was deafening. I could practically hear my family's minds racing, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The struggling restaurant worker they'd been pitying and offering career advice to was apparently the owner of Bella Vista. Not just this location but multiple locations. Multiple profitable locations. Mike found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a croak. Owner. Yes, I replied simply. Of this restaurant? This one and several others. Jennifer was staring at me like I'd just performed a magic trick. Lisa, you own restaurants? I own a restaurant group, I clarified. Bella Vista is the flagship, but there are 6 locations now. Mom was looking around the elegant dining room with new eyes, seeing everything differently now that she understood it belonged to me. Lisa, honey, how long have you? When did you? I opened the first Bella Vista 7 years ago, I explained. The others followed as the concept proved successful. Dad was doing calculations in his head, I could tell. Lisa, if you own 6 restaurants, what is that? What kind of business are we talking about? Last year the restaurant group generated about $32 million in revenue, I said calmly. The number hit the table like a physical force. Mike's face went completely pale. Jennifer made a small choking sound. Mom and Dad exchanged glances of pure shock. 32 million, Mike repeated slowly as if testing whether the words made sense in that order. Revenue, not profit, I clarified. But yes, it's been a successful venture. Marcus appeared again, this time carrying a leather portfolio and looking slightly apologetic. Miss Chen, I'm sorry to interrupt again, but the investors from Chicago are confirmed for Tuesday's meeting about the franchise expansion. They're particularly interested in the profit margins from the suburban locations. He set the portfolio next to my plate. Also, Food and Wine wants to schedule the photo shoot for the Rising Restaurant Empires feature. Should I have them coordinate with your assistant? Food and Wine. The phrase seemed to hang in the air above our table like an expensive chandelier. After Marcus left, Mike was the first to speak, though his voice was barely audible. Lisa, you're being featured in Food and Wine magazine? It's just a small piece about successful restaurant concepts, I replied. Nothing major. Nothing major? Jennifer echoed. Lisa, Food and Wine is huge. That's national recognition. Kevin was scrolling through his phone frantically. Oh my God, Lisa, I'm looking you up online. Chen Restaurant Group, 6 locations and growing. There's a whole article here about your expansion plans. He continued reading from his screen. Lisa Chen, 31, has built one of the city's most successful independent restaurant groups. Lisa, this article says you started with a single location and built it into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. The business has grown over time, I agreed. Mom was still processing everything, her expression cycling between shock, pride, and what looked like embarrassment. Lisa, why didn't you tell us? All this time we thought you were. You thought I was what? I asked gently. Struggling, she admitted quietly. We thought you were working for other people, maybe struggling to make ends meet. Mike was staring at the leather portfolio Marcus had left. What's in there? Probably financial reports, I said. Monthly profit and loss statements, expansion projections, investor communications. Investor communications, Mike repeated. Lisa, you have investors? Several. The expansion into suburban markets required additional capital. Dad leaned forward, his businessman instincts kicking in despite his shock. Lisa, what are your profit margins like? In the restaurant business, I mean. They vary by location and season, but we maintain healthy margins across all properties. The key is controlling costs while maintaining quality. The professional tone of my response seemed to drive home the reality that I wasn't just someone who happened to own restaurants. I was someone who understood the business inside and out, someone who spoke the language of profit margins and investor relations and market expansion. I need to ask, Mike said, his voice carefully controlled, what you're actually worth. Personally. Because I've been sitting here talking about career advancement and financial security like I was some kind of authority, and now I find out you own a restaurant empire. Restaurant empire. The phrase would have seemed ridiculous an hour ago. Now it just sounded accurate. I'm comfortable, I replied, using the same phrase I always used when people asked about money. Comfortable. Mike pressed. Lisa, If your restaurants generate 32 million in revenue, comfortable doesn't really capture it, does it? I considered how much to share. The business has been good to me. But Mike wasn't satisfied with diplomatic answers anymore. Lisa, I need a number. Roughly. Because I need to understand how badly I've misread this situation. The desperation in his voice was painful to hear. This wasn't just curiosity. This was a man realizing that his entire understanding of his family dynamics had been completely wrong. My personal net worth is about 14 million, I said quietly. 14 million. The number seemed to suck all the air out of our section of the restaurant. Mike was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his half-finished steak. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Lisa, I don't know what to say. The things I said tonight, the way I've talked to you for years. I thought I was helping someone who needed guidance. I know, I replied gently. But you didn't need my guidance. You didn't need anyone's guidance. You built something incredible while I was lecturing you about career advancement. Jennifer was looking at me with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. Lisa, when Mike talks about work, when he brags about his sales numbers and his promotions, you must think I think you're proud of your accomplishments, I said honestly. As you should be. But compared to what you've built, Mike said, my little regional sales territory seems pretty small. Success isn't a competition, Mike. You've built a good career that supports your family. That matters. Marcus appeared one final time, approaching with his usual professional courtesy but carrying what looked like a wine bottle. Miss Chin, with compliments from the sommelier. He noticed you were celebrating a family anniversary and wanted to offer something special from the reserve collection. He showed me the label, a bottle worth several $100s from our exclusive wine cellar. Also, I wanted to let you know that the restaurant critics' review is going very well. She seems particularly impressed with the service standards and the consistency across all course offerings. After he left, Dad picked up the expensive wine bottle and examined the label with something approaching reverence. Lisa, he said slowly, this wine probably costs more than most people spend on groceries in a month. The sommelier chose well, I agreed. And he gave it to us because you own the restaurant. He gave it to us because it's your anniversary and he wanted to make the evening special. But we all understood the real reason. The sommelier, like everyone else on the staff, knew exactly who I was and wanted to ensure my family received exceptional treatment. Mom reached across the table and took my hand. Lisa, honey, can you help me understand something? I waited. All these years when we worried about you, when Mike offered to help you find stable work, when we assumed you were struggling, why didn't you tell us the truth? It was the question I'd been expecting for years, and the answer was both simple and complicated. Because you never asked what I actually did, I said carefully. You saw me working in restaurants and assumed that meant I was an employee, not an owner. You made assumptions about my situation and my success level, and I let you keep those assumptions. Mike was nodding slowly. We never asked the right questions. You asked if I was still in the restaurant business, but you never asked what my role was in that business. You assumed I was working for other people rather than building my own company. Jennifer was shaking her head in amazement. All those times Mike worried about your future, about your financial security. I knew you were trying to help, I said. I appreciated that you cared even if the help wasn't necessary. But Lisa, Dad said, surely you could see that we were misunderstanding your situation. Why not correct us? I considered how to explain this without sounding accusatory. Because I wanted to see who you were when you thought I was struggling. I wanted to know how you treated family members you perceived as less successful than you. The truth of that statement settled over the table like expensive tablecloth. They were realizing that their behavior toward me hadn't been based on love and concern alone. It had been based on their assumptions about hierarchy, about who was successful and who needed help, about who had the right to give advice and who was obligated to receive it. That's fair, Mike said quietly. And we failed that test, didn't we? You didn't fail anything, I replied. You were human. But yes, you treated me differently because you thought I was struggling. We were condescending, Jennifer added. God, Lisa, I'm so embarrassed about some of the things I've said to you over the years. The wine Marcus had brought was exceptional, and as we finished our anniversary dinner, the conversation gradually shifted. My family began asking different kinds of questions, Not the worried, patronizing questions they'd been asking for years, but genuine questions about my business, my expansion plans, my challenges and successes. How did you know restaurants were the right business for you? Mom asked. I started working in them in college and fell in love with the hospitality industry. The challenge of creating experiences people remember, building teams that work together seamlessly, developing concepts that resonate with customers, it all appealed to me. And you saw a business opportunity, Dad added. I saw several business opportunities. The restaurant industry is incredibly competitive, but there's always room for concepts that deliver consistent quality and genuine hospitality. Mike was listening intently, his earlier embarrassment giving way to genuine curiosity about how I'd built the business. What was the hardest part? The first 2 years, I replied without hesitation. Learning to manage cash flow, finding the right staff, establishing systems that could scale. I made a lot of expensive mistakes. But you learned from them, Jennifer observed. Had to. In the restaurant business, mistakes are expensive and very visible. You learn quickly or you fail quickly. As we prepared to leave, Mike pulled me aside in the lobby. Lisa, I owe you an apology. Not just for tonight, but for years of treating you like someone who needed my guidance instead of someone who had her own path figured out. Mike, you don't need to. Yes, I do, he interrupted. I've been a condescending ass to you. I've assumed things about your life and your success that were completely wrong. And I've offered you advice you didn't need from a position of authority I didn't actually have. I could see how much this admission was costing him. Mike had built his identity around being the successful older brother, the one who had it all figured out, the one who could help guide his younger sister through life's challenges. Learning that his sister was more successful than he was, that she'd built something remarkable while he was offering her career advice, had to be devastating to that self-image. I appreciate that, I said. But Mike, your success doesn't diminish just because mine is different than you thought. Doesn't it though? He asked. I mean, I've been bragging about my sales numbers and my company car to someone who owns 6 restaurants. Your sales numbers matter, I insisted. Your company car matters. Your success matters. It doesn't matter less just because my business happens to be larger. He nodded, but I could see he was still struggling to process everything. As we stood outside the restaurant saying our goodbyes, Mom hugged me tightly. I'm proud of you, Lisa. I should have said that more often, and I should have said it based on understanding what you'd actually accomplished. Thank you, Mom. That means everything. One by one they each said goodbye, and each goodbye felt different than the ones I'd received from them in years past. These weren't the careful, slightly worried goodbyes they gave to their struggling family member. These were the goodbyes you give to someone you respect and admire. The next morning I woke up to a text from Mike. Lisa, would you have time for coffee this week? I want to learn about your business. Really learn, not just pretend to understand while I wait to give you advice I'm not qualified to give. I smiled and texted back, I'd love that. Maybe family dinners would be different from now on. Maybe they'd finally see me as I actually was rather than who they'd assumed I was. Maybe the next time we celebrated an anniversary, it would be a dinner between equals rather than a charity event disguised as a celebration. I was looking forward to finding out. 2 days later, Mike called with an update. Lisa, I told everyone at work about your restaurant group. I hope that's okay. I wanted people to know how incredible my sister is. For the first time in years, Mike was bragging about me instead of bragging to me. It was a small change, but it felt revolutionary. That's more than okay, I told him. Thank you. No thank you, he replied. For building something amazing and for being patient with a brother who took way too long to see it. Family dynamics I'd learned could change. It just took the right revelation at the right moment, preferably delivered by a professional general manager in front of a dining room full of witnesses. Sometimes the best revenge was simply letting people discover the truth.